Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Before the rooster found its voice and while the stars still blinked like tired lanterns, Patrick Ocone was already splashing cold water over his broad, bony chest. His bare feet slapped the wet cement floor with the confidence of a man who believed his own lies. It was the same ritual every morning. First, he would groan loudly while stretching his arms, then drag his tattered sponge across his neck like a man trying to scrub off the weight of the world. The old zinc roofing above the bathroom rattled from the breeze, but Patrick didn't mind. He hummed as he bathed, a deep baritone tune that had no name but gave him the air of a man who had somewhere important to be. He'd step out with steam rising off his skin like the pride he carried in his heart. He'd slap cream across his face, comb his thinning hair backward, and wear the only good pair of trousers he had left. It was an ash-gray pair that once sat proudly on his hips but now hung loosely, held up by a rope that used to be the cord of his radio. Over the years, the trousers had seen more church pews than his heart had seen reflection, but they still carried him forward, head high, shoulders back. He would tuck in a shirt and sling a cracked leather bag across his body. That bag was always suspiciously light, too light to carry tools, a notebook, or even a flask. But nobody asked questions. Nobody ever asked. By the time the sky began to blush with morning, Patrick would have already left the compound, greeting neighbors with a confident nod and a mysterious grin that said, "I'm not like the rest of you." To the people of Uber village, he was a working-class man with his affairs in order. Some believed he was in construction work in the next town. Others thought he was into transport business. He once mentioned he handled logistics, and left it at that. In a place where dignity was often measured by how early your husband left home and how clean his shirt looked, Patrick ranked high on the imaginary ladder. Young men envied his stride. Women greeted him with soft respect, thinking he was a hard-working man. But beneath that polished surface was a rotting truth. Patrick hadn't worked a day in 4 years. Not a single one. What he truly handled was a dice cup, and what he transported daily were lies and misplaced pride. While others were hammering nails and driving buses, Patrick spent his time in the back of an old mechanic's shed that now served as a makeshift gambling den. The place reeked of sweat, cheap gin, and lost hopes. The floor was dusty, the benches were broken, and yet it was where Patrick felt most powerful. He would shout at the dice, curse his luck, and beg for just one more roll. Every loss was followed by another lie. He had convinced himself that one big win would fix everything, would wash away years of deception like rain sweeping off dry dust. Back at home, his wife Margaret had learned not to speak. Her silence was not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that grows when truth becomes a burden too heavy to say aloud. She knew. Of course she knew. A woman knows when her man leaves with an empty bag and returns with an empty pocket. She saw the signs long before the neighbors ever smelled smoke. She noticed the way his clothes never smelled of cement or oil, how he always returned before sunset, tired but with nothing to show for it. Patrick always had an excuse. They didn't pay today, or the truck broke down, or my Oga traveled. At first, she asked questions. Then she stopped. Her voice had no place in a house where the roof was held up by denial. She became the breadwinner in secret, selling cooked beans by the roadside under a torn umbrella, sewing small patches on people's clothes, and sometimes going to bed hungry so that the children could have half a meal. Her hands were cracked from overwork, and her eyes carried the sorrow of 10 lifetimes. Yet every morning, she would hand the children their lunch, smooth down their collars, and say, "Respect your father." Not because she believed he deserved it, but because she feared what the truth would do to their young hearts. Daniel, the older child, had started to notice. At 13, his mind was sharper than Patrick gave him credit for. He watched the world through a lens of suspicion, storing small clues like stones in his pocket. He noticed how his father never talked about work in specifics, how he flinched when asked for school fees, how he never came home with the exhaustion other fathers wore like badges of honor. Daniel's eyes began to narrow during those morning rituals, watching Patrick like a hawk studying prey. Sometimes he'd ask subtle questions. "What's your office like? What do you eat for lunch at work?" Patrick would bark a vague reply, then change the subject. Blessing, the younger one, was still wrapped in childhood's warm ignorance. At 9, all she wanted was new sandals for school and an occasional meat in her rice. She still believed her father was a great man. But Daniel, who had once drawn pictures of his dad holding a briefcase, now kept his drawings locked in a box under his bed, hidden away like something sacred that had lost its power. Patrick, blind to the quiet shift in his household, continued with his act. To him, the world was a stage, and he was its misunderstood hero. What he didn't realize was that the curtains were beginning to draw back, and the audience, his own family, had stopped clapping. The market that day was a hive of noise, bargaining voices colliding with the clatter of tin basins and the sweet scent of tomatoes in the sun. Margaret stood behind her modest stand, her body half shaded by an umbrella whose blue had faded into gray. Her pot of beans sat half full, the aroma catching the noses of passers-by who paused but didn't buy. She didn't mind. The pot was more than food, it was her shield, her daily proof that she was trying. That afternoon, she sat low on a stool, back slightly hunched, eyes far away as if searching a world no one else could see. The village had grown noisier in recent months, but inside Margaret, everything was quieter than ever. She hadn't planned to speak, but silence can dry out the tongue and swell the heart. When Mama Chioma appeared and offered her a warm hello, the words slipped from Margaret's lips before she realized she'd let them out. "I envy women whose husbands go to work and come back with food," she murmured, her voice soft, not bitter, just tired. Chioma leaned in, her plump face scrunching in curiosity. "But doesn't your husband work in town?" Margaret didn't lift her eyes. Her hands moved instead, scooping beans into a nylon bag, slow and deliberate. "He leaves, yes. But he doesn't work." That was it. A simple confession, said like someone announcing it might rain. There was no accusation in her tone, no venom, only the dry, exhausted breath of someone who had carried too much for too long. Chioma's silence said more than words could. She gave a slow nod, the kind that told Margaret she had seen storms like this before, in other compounds, behind other closed doors. But words, once freed, carry feet of their own, and that sentence did not stop with Chioma. By the time the sun leaned westward and the red sand glowed like fire beneath people's feet, Margaret's quiet confession had become a wildfire. In Uber, truth traveled like a gossiping bird, perching on one ear, flapping to the next, each time louder, each time twisted. What began as a whisper had swelled into something jagged and sharp. Margaret didn't know, not yet. She had packed up her stand, tied the leftover beans into nylon bags, and headed home with Daniel and Blessing walking quietly behind her. Her feet ached, but it was a familiar pain. She entered the compound, greeted the neighbor's daughter who was plaiting hair under the mango tree, and began to wash the dishes from earlier in the morning. The children had gone inside, Daniel already reaching for his assignments, Blessing searching for her doll's missing leg. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Then came the voices. Loud, sharp, fast. They entered like thunder after a long dry silence. The gate flung open, not with politeness but with purpose, and in marched Cecilia, Patrick's elder sister, her head tie knotted like a warrior's flag. Behind her were two of her brothers, both older, both stiff-faced men who walked like law. "Margaret!" Cecilia called, her voice slicing through the air like a machete. "Where is she?" "Let her come out and explain herself." Margaret stepped forward, drying her hands on the edge of her wrapper, unsure of the storm that had gathered. She didn't get to ask before the accusations began flying like arrows. "You told the whole market your husband is jobless? You exposed him to disgrace? You want to ruin our family name?" The words fell on her like cold rain. She tried to speak, but Cecilia was already circling her like a hawk around prey. "How dare you humiliate your husband in public? You think you're better than us because you sell beans? Foolish woman." The brothers remained mostly silent, their presence alone adding weight. One of them stepped forward and pushed her shoulder, not hard, but firm enough to draw gasps from the neighbors gathering at the fence. Margaret staggered back a little, holding her chest, not out of fear but out of shock. Not one of them asked her if what she said was true. Not one of them cared. That evening, the compound felt like a courtroom after a sentencing. The neighbors had dispersed, their eyes still wide with second-hand embarrassment, some with pity, others with silent judgments curling in their thoughts. Patrick returned just as the sky began to dim. He walked in whistling, an off-tune melody that clashed painfully with the heavy air in the house. He didn't seem to notice the silence at first, didn't see Daniel staring from the corner with clenched fists, or Blessing biting her lip nervously. Margaret stood by the cooking area, but there was no food, no aroma, no flame beneath the pot. Patrick's nose twitched. "You haven't cooked?" he asked casually, removing his shoes and stretching his toes like a man returning from a long day at work. Margaret didn't answer. She simply turned and went inside. Her hands trembled slightly, though she hid it well. Patrick followed after a few minutes, the silence too loud to ignore. Inside the room, Daniel stood up. His face was no longer boyish. There was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Why did they beat Mummy?" he asked, voice steady, hands shaking. Patrick looked at him, startled. "What are you talking about? Your people came. They beat her. They insulted her. Because she told the truth." There was no fear in the boy's voice, just quiet rage. Patrick looked from Daniel to Margaret, then back at Daniel. He wanted to say something, anything, but his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Blessing sat by the corner, tears pooling in her eyes, though she didn't yet understand what she was crying for. The house, once held together by fragile routines and invisible strings, now felt like it was unraveling thread by thread. The days that followed crawled like wounded lizards. Patrick had stopped whistling. He still woke early, still bathed, still dressed in his usual get-up, but something in his rhythm had lost its balance. He avoided eye contact with Margaret, whose silence had become a wall too thick to climb. She moved like a ghost inside the house, doing what needed to be done, but saying nothing more than was necessary. The children, too, changed. Daniel rarely spoke unless spoken to. He did his schoolwork with a fierce focus, as though solving sums could erase what he'd witnessed. Blessing clung more to her mother now, her laughter becoming a rare sound. Patrick tried to reclaim normalcy, offering small talks at dinner, commenting on the weather, even pretending to receive phone calls about imaginary work problems. But the air in the house remained stiff, unmoved by his performances. On the fourth morning after the incident, he paused by the mirror longer than usual. He stared at himself, not to admire, but as if searching for something that had gone missing. His face looked older, his eyes duller. He ran a hand across his chin, sighed, then picked up his bag and left. Outside, neighbors still greeted him politely, but some had started looking at him differently, longer stares, tighter smiles. He knew. Deep down, he knew the truth had started to slip through the cracks. Like smoke in a locked room, it was only a matter of time before it filled everything. The house had taken on a kind of stillness that made even the sound of footsteps feel disrespectful. It wasn't the peace that follows healing. It was the hush that arrives before something finally breaks. Days moved slowly, each one dragging its feet like an old man with worn-out slippers. The air inside the rooms was thick with things unsaid, and no breeze, no matter how strong, could clear it. Margaret no longer moved like a wife trying to hold her family together. She moved like a woman trying not to lose herself in a place where she was seen but not heard. Her face had become unreadable, like a weathered diary with the ink all washed away. When she spoke to the children, her voice was gentle but precise. When she addressed Patrick, she spoke with the tone of someone discussing business, never too warm, never inviting conversation. The pot she used to stir soup had not felt meat in a long time, and the children's plates had begun to mirror the silence around them. Portions smaller, colors duller. Even the rats seemed to understand they weren't welcome. Patrick had started to linger outside before coming home, standing near junctions as if the dusk might offer a better answer than his own front door. He was not the kind of man to apologize, not because he lacked guilt, but because he believed admitting fault was a kind of surrender he couldn't afford. Still, there were moments, tiny flashes, when regret crept into his eyes like the edge of a storm cloud. He'd glance at Daniel during dinner, watch the boy's head bent over his food, and sometimes open his mouth as if to say something. But the words never made it out. They got stuck somewhere between his pride and his shame. Daniel had taken on a kind of quiet maturity that didn't belong on a 13-year-old's shoulders. He moved with the carefulness of someone walking on broken glass, never sure where the next shard would be. He still went to school, still did his homework, but there was a distance in his eyes now, as though he had grown older overnight and had seen things boys his age shouldn't have to see. He no longer asked questions, especially not about his father. His curiosity had dried up, replaced by observation. He watched everything. He noticed how Patrick no longer brought anything home. No biscuits, no pencils, not even small coins for snacks. He noticed how his mother's wrapper was beginning to thin at the edges, the colors fading like her laughter. When Margaret returned from the market each evening, Daniel would help carry the bags inside without being asked. It wasn't about being obedient. It was about survival, about lifting what little weight he could from a woman who was carrying more than her share. Even Blessing, playful and naive, had begun to mirror the mood of the house. She didn't understand all the details, but she could feel the cracks under her feet, like walking on a frozen lake that could give way at any time. Sometimes she would sit beside her mother without saying a word, just holding onto her arm like a child trying to keep a kite from drifting too far. The television hadn't been on in weeks. The battery-powered radio only played when Margaret needed to drown out the sound of her thoughts. The silence wasn't chosen, it was inherited, passed down from day to day like a tattered inheritance that nobody wanted but couldn't escape. Patrick, for all his denial, had begun to feel the change not just in his home, but in his own skin. He still dressed every morning, still bathed before the cock crowed, but even the act had lost its rhythm. The sponge felt rougher, the water colder, the shirt tighter around the neck. He would sit longer at the edge of the bed after dressing, staring at the cracked wall like it owed him answers. The gambling den had changed too. The laughs weren't as free as before. The men who once welcomed him with slaps on the back now watched him with wary eyes. Word had gotten around, not from his mouth, never that, but rumors tend to walk ahead of their owners. Some said his wife had exposed him, others said he was running from debts. Either way, respect had started to slip through his fingers like sand. Even Mr. Edem, who once smiled at his arrival, had begun to lower his eyes when Patrick entered, no longer offering him the front seat. The dice no longer rolled in his favor. He'd lose, borrow, then lose again. He blamed everything but himself, the sun, the players, the dice themselves. He told anyone who asked that things were just tight for now, that his real business was taking shape soon. But the truth was louder in his mind than any lie he could speak. He owed more than he could count, not just in money but in dignity. And every day, it became harder to carry the weight of pretending. He started returning home later than usual, sometimes waiting until the children were asleep to avoid their eyes. But Margaret was always awake, always seated by the window or near the stove, even if the fire had long gone cold. She never asked where he'd been. That silence was her loudest punishment. One night, while the wind whispered through the cracks in their roof, Patrick stood in the doorway and looked at his family as if seeing them for the first time in years. Daniel was asleep, one hand curled under his cheek, the other resting on his schoolbook. Blessing was curled beside her mother, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Margaret sat with her back to him, sewing a small tear on a pillowcase that had lost its fluff. Her fingers moved slowly, almost absent-mindedly, as though the act was more for her mind than for the cloth. Patrick opened his mouth, not to accuse, not to lie, but to speak plainly. Yet nothing came. There was no apology he could offer that would repair the quiet war his absence had started. He stepped back, closed the door, and sat outside under the mango tree until the night swallowed the sound of his breathing. A stray dog passed, sniffed near him, and moved on, finding nothing of interest. The sky was cloudy, and the moon, like everything else in his life, had gone into hiding. Margaret didn't come out to call him, didn't send Daniel to look for him. It was as if his absence inside the house made no difference anymore. And perhaps it didn't. The clouds gathered like debt collectors in the sky, heavy and gray, casting long shadows over the earth as though nature itself was holding its breath. The wind carried the smell of coming rain mixed with dust, and every door in Uber village creaked softly under its weight. Patrick sat by the corner of the old gambling shed, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely clasped together as though in prayer but without faith. The floor was littered with stubs of palm wine sachets, faded playing cards, and the kind of silence that comes after too many losses. It had become harder to mask the tremor in his hands, the small shake that betrayed his desperation each time he reached for the dice. There was a time, not too long ago, when he walked into the den with a swagger and a smirk, when men rose to greet him, and his word carried the weight of someone whose luck could be borrowed. Now the same men leaned away when he entered, conversations paused, and laughter thinned out like smoke meeting rain. His presence had shifted from amusing to burdensome, like a tune played one too many times. The last money he held had been borrowed from a relative who never smiled, a man whose thin lips and thick fists warned against default. But the dice didn't care about warnings. That final throw, a desperate roll that clattered loudly against a broken table, had given him nothing. Nothing but silence and stares. He didn't curse this time. He just stared at the pieces as though they had betrayed him personally, then got up and walked out with no one stopping him. Even the air outside didn't welcome him. He walked home with his shoulders drooped, and his shoes dragging like a tired secret. When he got back, the compound was almost empty. The neighbors were all inside, hiding from the sky's threat of rain. The small chickens that usually pecked the ground had taken cover beneath the water drums. The gate creaked louder than usual when he pushed it open, and for some reason, that sound echoed deeper in his chest. Inside the room, the kerosene lamp glowed faintly, casting a shaky orange light across the walls. Margaret was mending a school uniform on the floor, Daniel sitting nearby with a ruler and textbook open, his pen scratching steadily. Blessing lay across the bed, fast asleep with one sock off and her hair undone. The scent of fried oil lingered, but there was no food in sight, only the leftover signs of a dinner he hadn't been expected for. He stood there for a long while, but no one looked up. It was not hostility, it was worse than that. It was indifference. He cleared his throat, hoping someone would respond. Only Daniel's pen paused for a brief moment, then resumed. Margaret didn't lift her head. Her fingers continued threading the needle with slow precision, as if the shirt in her hands was more real than the man who had entered. Patrick stepped further in, muttering, "Good evening," though it felt pointless. No one replied. He lowered himself onto the stool by the door, the one that used to be reserved for visitors. He could feel it then, not just that he was losing his family, but that perhaps he already had. The room, their tiny room that once held warmth even in poverty, now felt like a space he was trespassing. His children's laughter no longer danced through it. His wife's voice, once soft and warm even in disagreement, had gone quiet. He wanted to say something, to apologize perhaps, but the words curdled before reaching his mouth. Instead, he sat in that silence, surrounded by people who once loved him loudly, but now only endured him quietly. 3 days later, the warning came. It didn't arrive with a knock or a shout, but with a voice so low it barely rose above the hum of the generator outside. Patrick had returned to the gambling shed, unable to sit in his own house any longer. The silence inside was too loud, the eyes too honest. He needed the noise, the chaos of the den, even if it no longer welcomed him. But he didn't make it past the corner that day. As he turned into the narrow path behind the mechanic's shop, a man stepped out from the shadows. Tall, lean, with a faded scar stretching from his jaw to his ear. His voice was gravelly, stripped of emotion. "Maka says your time is up." That was all he said. No threats. No reminders of the debt. Just those 6 words. Patrick's throat dried up instantly. His knees weakened beneath him, and his mouth moved in silence, forming pleas that never came. Maka the Bone was not a man who issued threats twice. He didn't need to. Stories of what happened to those who delayed payment traveled like curses. Men disappearing, market stalls burned, family members frightened into exile. Patrick stumbled backward, nodding too quickly, muttering a promise he didn't believe himself. The man watched him without blinking, then turned and disappeared into the alley as silently as he had come. Patrick stood there, heart pounding, unable to move. The dice, the debts, the lies, all of it had now become a rope tightening around his neck. He had danced too long on the edge, thinking luck would save him. But luck had long since left the room, and now consequence had come knocking. He turned around and walked home, though it no longer felt like a home he was returning to. By the time the rain finally came, it was not the gentle kind that cooled the earth. It was violent, angry, tearing through the sky like something had finally snapped. Thunder cracked above the rooftops, lightning splitting the darkness with sharp, silent judgment. Margaret stood by the door of their room, one arm wrapped around Blessing, who was shivering in her sleep. Daniel sat near the window, watching the rain like he was waiting for it to wash something away. Patrick had not returned. He had left before dawn, telling no one, his shirt collar stretched and his bag swinging loosely like a man preparing for something final. Margaret said nothing. She had learned not to ask questions whose answers didn't matter. She sat near the stove, not cooking, just sitting. Her fingers rested on her knees, still and calm, like someone who had made peace with the storm. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the zinc, and water dripped steadily from the corner of the ceiling. Daniel turned to his mother. "Do you think he'll come back?" he asked, not out of worry, but out of curiosity. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She stared at the lamp, watched its flame sway in the breeze, then finally spoke. "Some men leave long before their feet do. Sometimes coming back means nothing." The words hung in the air, soft and sharp all at once. That night, none of them slept deeply. The storm outside roared like a warning, while inside, the quiet grew thicker. And somewhere far away, under that same rain, Patrick walked alone. No umbrella, no destination, just the sound of thunder behind him and the knowledge that his luck had finally run dry. The night was long, the kind that stretches time until the hours feel like days and the silence wraps around your bones like a second skin. Patrick didn't know how far he had walked or how many turns he had taken. His feet moved without permission, dragging him forward through pools of muddy water and across narrow paths he didn't recognize. His shirt clung to him like regret, soaked through and stained with sweat, rain, and something else he couldn't name. The sky had opened up hours ago, but the clouds above showed no mercy. They spilled endlessly, not just with rain but with everything Patrick had avoided: truth, shame, and the fear that now chewed at his thoughts like termites in a quiet house. He walked with no umbrella, no plan, no name on his lips. Just forward. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he imagined Margaret rising to find his space on the bed empty, Daniel looking out the window, Blessing asking where Papa went. But even that picture felt borrowed. He had stretched the threads that connected him to his family so thin that now, even in his imagination, he felt like a ghost. There was no destination in his step, just motion. He crossed into the next town without realizing it, the shops shuttered and the gutters brimming. His legs began to ache, but stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. Every time he paused, Maka's face appeared in his mind, followed by the quiet, cold voice of the man with the scar. The debt had become more than money now. It had grown teeth. Morning came without permission, gray and wet, swallowing the night like a secret. Patrick found shelter beneath an abandoned shed, its wooden beams eaten by time, and its roof dotted with holes that still allowed the rain to kiss his shoulders. He didn't sleep. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, his eyes hollow from the kind of tired that has nothing to do with the body. His thoughts wandered, not toward solutions, he'd run out of those, but toward moments. He remembered Margaret's laughter in their first year of marriage, before silence built its home between them. He remembered Daniel's first steps, how the boy had walked straight into his arms and laughed like the world was still new. He remembered Blessing's birth, how her tiny hand had curled around his finger, how he had cried when no one was looking. Where had that man gone? He tried to summon him, to resurrect the version of himself who once believed he would do better, be better. But all that remained now was the shell, the aftertaste of a life poorly lived. He pulled the leather bag onto his lap, the same bag that had carried nothing for years but ego, and opened it. Inside were crumpled betting slips, an expired ID card, and a pen that no longer worked. He stared at the slips for a long while, as though they might rearrange themselves into something redemptive. But they didn't. They were just paper. Faded, useless, and heavy in a way that surprised him. The wind howled through the broken planks, whistling like a reminder that nothing stays hidden forever. Back in Uber, the house had adjusted in a way only households ruled by survival can. Margaret did not panic. She did not ask neighbors if they had seen him. She did not search, cry, or call his name in the market like a woman abandoned. She simply shifted. She woke early as usual, swept the front of the compound, boiled water, fed the children, and prepared her goods for the day's trade. Her silence no longer carried sadness, it carried certainty. When Daniel asked quietly if his father would come back, she did not offer promises. When people carry their feet too far, they lose the road, she said. Daniel didn't ask again. The boy had become taller in recent months, not just in body but in posture. He walked with a sense of weight, the kind of gravity usually found in older men. He had started helping Margaret more, not out of obligation but out of love. She didn't have to ask. He simply took the pot in the mornings, stood beside her at the roadside, watched for change, and learned the small rhythms of survival. Blessing remained light, her innocence only slightly dented. She still asked questions, sometimes funny, sometimes sharp. Why doesn't Papa come home with stories like other daddies? Margaret would look at her and smile softly. Because some stories are too long to tell. The house was no longer waiting. It was moving. Like a river that had stopped expecting the mountain to part and instead learned to flow around it. No bitterness. Just direction. On the 7th night, a letter came, not brought by a postman, not handed in secret, but slipped under the door as though carried by the wind itself. Margaret found it when she stepped out to sweep, a small folded paper tucked against the doorway, half damp from the night. She picked it up slowly, opened it without drama. Inside was no letter, no name, no words at all, just a piece of paper with a child's drawing. A man, small and hunched, walking in the rain with a bag over his shoulder. The figure was surrounded by gray strokes, and in one hand, it held a single red dice. Nothing else. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Her fingers didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She folded the drawing neatly, tucked it into the back of her wrapper, and went back to sweeping. Later that day, she placed it in an old wooden box beneath her clothes, the one that held birth certificates, old photographs, and receipts from a life that hadn't turned out the way anyone expected. That night, when Daniel finished his homework and sat beside her, she said something she hadn't said in weeks. "Tomorrow we start something new." He looked at her, confused but curious. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. In her eyes there was no anger left, only a kind of peace that comes when a wound is no longer bleeding. The rain returned that night, softer this time, like it had remembered how to be kind. And inside the small room, 3 people slept quietly, not because the world had become perfect, but because they had stopped waiting for it to be. The early hours of the morning carried a stillness that felt heavier than usual, as though even time was reluctant to move forward. Margaret sat by the stove without lighting it, her hands resting on her lap, not clasped or fidgeting, just there still. The wind had finally calmed after nights of unrelenting rustling, and the rain, which had become more frequent, held back that morning as if out of respect. Daniel emerged from the room quietly, already dressed in his school uniform. He didn't ask what was for breakfast. He knew there was Gary in the blue bowl on the floor, and if it was enough, it would be shared without question. Margaret stood slowly, poured a little water into the pot, not to cook anything substantial but to warm it, perhaps to trick the body into believing something meaningful was coming. Blessing came out next, still rubbing her eyes, her wrapper slipping from one shoulder, her braids unraveling at the edges. She leaned against her mother's side without speaking. That had become their rhythm, few words, just shared presence. Margaret looked down at her daughter, gently adjusted the wrapper around her, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. It was the kind of affection that didn't ask questions or offer explanations. They had all learned to survive in silence, and in that silence, something resembling strength had taken root. The kind of strength that doesn't scream or declare itself, but exists simply because it must. That morning, Margaret tied her headscarf tightly, secured her basin of beans and peeled yam, and called Daniel to carry the bench. She didn't wait to be helped. She had already accepted that the weight would always be hers to bear. Across town, in a place where no one called his name, Patrick sat beneath a rusted zinc overhang near a roadside welding shop. The men there didn't ask who he was or where he came from. They simply accepted his presence the way you tolerate a stain on your shirt that won't come out. He had found temporary work fetching water for the welders and cleaning up iron scraps scattered around the muddy compound. It paid him nothing substantial, just a few naira here and there, enough to buy 2 sachets of Gary and a roasted plantain when he was lucky. He no longer looked like the man who used to press his shirt and whistle as he left the house each morning. His hair had grown uneven and wild, his cheeks sunken, and the buttons on his shirt hung on for dear life. But it was the eyes that had changed most. They didn't hold light anymore, only echoes. He had stopped trying to count the days since he left home. There was no calendar, and the sky offered no comfort. Every now and then he would think of Daniel's voice, the way the boy had looked at him that evening in the room, or of Blessing's small arms always wrapped around someone's waist. But mostly he remembered Margaret's silence, the kind of silence that spoke of final decisions. He still carried the bag, though there was nothing in it now, not even the old slips. One morning, he had torn them all up and scattered them across the wind like ash, hoping they would carry his shame far enough that he might never see it again. But shame, like a shadow, has a way of sticking even when the sun is gone. Every day, he hoped for one more chance. Not to explain. He knew there was no explanation that could fix what he broke, but simply to be seen again by the people whose hearts he had been erased from. It was almost 2 weeks after the letter when a small boy from a nearby village came to Margaret's stand, holding a worn envelope. He handed it over shyly, said nothing, and quickly disappeared into the afternoon crowd. Margaret didn't open it right away. She placed it under her basin, sold beans to 2 customers, answered 3 price hagglers, and adjusted her headscarf twice. Only after the rush died down did she sit and unfold it. Inside was no letter, just another drawing. This time, the image was of a house. The lines were shaky, like they'd been drawn with tired hands. Outside the house was a tree, and beneath the tree was a man sitting alone on a stool. In the corner of the drawing, faint but clear, was a small dice drawn in red ink. She stared at it for a long while, her eyes scanning every part as if looking for a message hidden in the lines. She folded the paper carefully, placed it inside her wrapper, and continued with her day. There were no tears, no heavy sighs, no words. Just that familiar stillness. That night, when Daniel came home, she showed him the drawing. He looked at it quietly, his face unreadable. "Are we going to look for him?" he asked. Margaret didn't reply. She walked to the wooden box where she kept everything of meaning: documents, school reports, photos, the first drawing, and added this new one beside the rest. She closed the box and turned away. Some people must sit with their loneliness until it teaches them something, she said. It wasn't bitterness in her tone. It was something deeper, a calm that only follows storms that don't end in thunder but in surrender. The final rain of the season came without noise. It arrived at night, soft and steady, without lightning or roar, like a curtain falling after a long performance. Inside the small room, Daniel slept with his book still open, Blessing curled beside her mother with a smile on her face. Margaret sat by the window, watching the rain beat against the rusted mosquito net. Her face was still, but her eyes held the kind of peace that comes only when pain has finally been put down like a heavy basket. Outside, the moon peeked shyly through parting clouds, its light falling gently on the ground. Somewhere far away, in another town's forgotten corner, a man sat beneath a tree, tracing lines in the sand with his finger, waiting for something that might never return. But back in Uber, the home he left no longer carried his weight. It had restructured itself. The walls hadn't crumbled. The roof hadn't fallen. The children still grew, ate, slept, and dreamt. The woman who once watched him leave every morning without speaking had now found her voice again, not loud but steady. And in her silence, she had rebuilt something stronger than promises. The rain that fell that night did not cleanse him. It did not offer redemption. It did not send signs. It simply rained. And when it stopped, only the things rooted in truth remained standing. Sometimes the loudest damage isn't done by anger or violence, but by silence, neglect, and pride wrapped in daily habits. If you're carrying your family with love, don't let someone else's laziness make you feel small. And if you're the one who's been drifting, come home, not just with your feet, but with your heart. Nothing good grows where truth is hidden. Fix it before what you're trying to protect forgets you entirely. May your hands never grow tired of doing good, even when it feels unseen. May your efforts bloom into joy that cannot be stolen. May your home never lack peace, and your heart never carry bitterness. May the one who left return with wisdom, or be replaced with something better. May God dry every secret tear, and replace struggle with soft mornings and safe nights. And may you never build your life around someone who's already walked away in spirit. In your rising, may nothing pull you back. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.